The Solemn League and Covenant is, in some respects, more famous still than that of which we have just been speaking. It was occasioned by the struggle maintained, quote, by an arbitrary and popishly affected court, unquote, against the friends of Reformation and liberty in these lands. It was prepared by Alexander Henderson, received the approbation of the General Assembly and the Convention of Estates, and was cordially subscribed by persons of all ranks in Scotland in the year 1643. Having been deliberately examined by the Venerable Assembly of Divines at Westminster, it was solemnly sworn in the Church of St. Margaret's, Westminster, by both Houses of Parliament, by the Assembly of Divines, and by persons of different ranks generally throughout England. In Ireland, too, it was joyfully received by many of the Protestants in the south, and by almost the whole body of the Protestant population in the north, although from the distracted state of things in that country it could not possibly obtain the same legislative sanction as in the other two kingdoms. This deed had for its main object, quote, the preservation of the Reformed religion in Scotland, the reformation of religion in England and Ireland, and the bringing of the churches in the three kingdoms to the nearest conformity in doctrine, worship, discipline, and government, unquote. And here a footnote, from which circumstances it has commonly been called the Solemn League and Covenant of the Three Kingdoms. An object more dutiful and benevolent, more sublime and glorious, it will be difficult to conceive, could our time have admitted of our going over the various articles of which it consisted. We should not have despaired of convincing you that in many respects the Solemn League is one of the most remarkable documents extant in the history of mankind. Yet neither the excellence of its matter, nor the importance of its object, nor the unanimity and cordiality with which it was adopted has proved sufficient to screen it from the vilest misrepresentation and most unmeasured abuse. Indeed, both the public covenants have been unsparingly censured, and the persons by whom they were framed liberally reviled. It becomes necessary, therefore, to take notice of some of the objections that have been brought against these famous deeds. A very common objection is that they were of a seditious character, treasonable in their matter and in the circumstances in which they formed. As regards the National Covenant, we reply that in one of its clauses the Covenanters distinctly, quote, protest and promise with their hearts to defend the king's person and authority with their goods, bodies, and lives against all enemies within this realm and without, unquote. Not a very seditious-looking clause, surely. That it was sworn by the king himself and the royal household, that it was sustained by repeated acts of Parliament, that in reference to its renovation in 1638, without the countenance of the throne, the most eminent and least suspected of the Scots lawyers, when consulted by the king himself, thanks to the royal cares of Charles I for providing us with so triumphant a reply, gave it as their opinion that, quote, the proceedings of the Covenanters were warranted by law, unquote. And here a footnote. His Majesty ordered that the most eminent and least suspected of the Scottish lawyers should be consulted concerning the legality of the Covenanters' proceedings in convening together without his authority, protesting against the proclamation of his royal pleasure, and entering into covenant without his command or concurrence. Sir Thomas Hope, the advocate for the Crown, with Nicholson and Sir Lewis Stewart of Blackhall, being thereupon advised, gave their opinion that the most part of the Covenanters' proceedings were warranted by law, and that, though in some things they seem to have exceeded, yet there was no express law against them. Stevenson's History, newest edition, page 213. Nay, we may add that this antiquated objection, which seems to have been borrowed from the worthy Samaritans of old, who charged the Covenanters in the days of Nehemiah with rebellion against the king of Persia, and which proceeds on the principle that subjects cannot lawfully enter into any bonds without the command or concurrence of their rulers, would conduct to the tyrannical conclusion that the people can never profess a religion, nor adopt a single measure of reform to which their superiors may happen to be hostile. A conclusion which, however worthy of the age of Trajan or Nero, the light of later times, must shame away forever into the shades of oblivion. As regards again the Solemn League, we have to say that in the third clause, the Covenanters bind themselves, quote, to preserve and defend the King's Majesty's person and authority in the preservation and defense of the true religion and liberties of the kingdom, unquote. While they declare, quote, that they have no thought nor intention to diminish His Majesty's just power and authority, unquote. We have to say, further, that the deed was formally and repeatedly ratified by Parliament, especially in 1644 and 1649, and finally we have to say that it was solemnly taken and subscribed by Charles II himself, both at Spey in 1650 and at Scone in 1651, however perfidiously dealt by afterwards on the part of that royal hypocrite and traitor. The time has gone by, we trust forever, when it was fashionable to represent these federal deeds as illegal and seditious combinations. Apart from the grounds of defense which have just been stated, who, we would ask, that calmly considers the circumstances of the times, will venture to pronounce them traitorous or unconstitutional? When every attempt on the part of the people was systematically thwarted, when the royal ear was stopped against all their complaints, when such was the tyranny of the age that it was held treasonable even to meet and petition in behalf of their liberties, who but must perceive that, so far from there being anything in them at variance with the duties of subjects, these very deeds were among the means which, under God, saved our country from absolute despotism, and helped to secure for Britain her much boasted and justly prized civil and religious freedom. Nor is it irrelevant here to remark that to the political principles avowed in the Covenants is the House of Hanover indebted for its seat at this moment on the British throne. The men, therefore, who acted so conspicuous a part in these transactions, instead of being stigmatized as rebels, ought, we contend, to be held in grateful remembrance as the truest patriots and best benefactors of their country. Equally unhappy are the enemies of these documents when they speak of them as asserting persecuting principles. This charge is founded principally on the expression in the second article of the Solemn League, in which it is said, quote, "We shall endeavor the extirpation of popery, prelacy, superstition, heresy, schism, profaneness, and whatsoever shall be found contrary to sound doctrine and the power of godliness," unquote. But what is there here which savors of persecution? Is there no method of rooting out errors but by putting to death the persons who hold them? The clause makes no mention of persons, but of principles, as the subjects of extirpation. And surely to use all lawful means of ridding the world of such false and abominable evils as are there enumerated was not only innocent, but praiseworthy. The heresies, not the heretics, were what the Covenanters had in view in the article in question. Any other construction is a gross perversion of their language. Their hostility to the evils specified was strong and uncompromising. They regarded them as plants which their heavenly Father had not planted, and they had the very best authority for seeking to have them rooted out or extirpated. But they never once contemplated offering violence to the persons of men. The Westminster Assembly, in their exhortation to the taking of the Solemn League, disclaims such an intention in so many words, quote, "Nor is any man, say they," speaking of the prelates, "hereby bound to offer any violence to their persons," unquote. This charge, then, however widely and loudly bruited, we hesitate not to pronounce an unfounded calumny, while at the same time we take leave to hint that it comes with a peculiarly bad grace from the party with whom it is in greatest favor, a party who have never been known at any time in Scotland but as sycophants and persecutors. Closely allied to this objection is the next of which we shall take notice, namely, that the covenants were enforced by, quote, "civil pains," unquote. This charge is founded on the terms of the Act of Parliament 1640, enjoining the subscription of the National Covenant. In reply to this allegation, we have to say, first of all, that this is not an objection against the covenants as such. These may have been most excellent and unexceptionable in themselves, although there may have been imprudence in those who undertook to promote their ends. But we have to say, further, that there is no evidence to prove that the subscription was not voluntary, but abundant evidence to the contrary. Persons who had the best opportunities of knowing have declared that, quote, "no threatenings were used except of the deserved judgments of God, and no force except the force of reason," unquote. Indeed, it appears the liberty to subscribe was withheld in some cases, in the case of some, till there should be time to try their sincerity and to prove that they acted from love to the cause and not from the fear of man. And here a footnote. In this day of the Lord's power, his people have most willingly offered themselves in multitudes like the dew of the morning. Others, of no small note, have offered their subscriptions and have been refused till time should try their sincerity from love of the cause and not from the fear of man. No threatenings have been used except the deserved judgments of God, nor force except the force of reason from the high respects which we owe to religion, to our king, to our native country, to ourselves, and to our posterity. That, from Answers to the Doctors of Aberdeen, by Henderson, Dixon, and Cant, pages 42 and 44. Besides, it ought to be borne in mind that these instruments had a civil as well as a religious object, and that although the latter might not warrant the infliction of civil pains, the same restriction did not apply to the former, and they ought, in candor, to be judged of in that complex character in which they were framed, enacted, sworn, and promoted. Moreover, there is good reason to think that all that this vexed and startling phrase in the act in question was ever intended to provide for was that the covenants should be employed as tests for qualification for office in proof of the candidate's attachment to the Reformation. Exclusion from places of power and trust, it is believed, is all that can be proved ever to have been inflicted under this obnoxious act. The phrase, quote, "under all civil pains," unquote, when taken literally and viewed by itself, may be deemed formidable looking enough, and calculated to call up, in the imaginations of the timid and the weak, the frightening ideas of fines, confiscations, imprisonments, executions, and similar, quote, chimeras dire, unquote. But when fairly interpreted by the light of history, it dwindles very innocently into, quote, no seat in Parliament, unquote. And surely, when the perilous circumstances are considered in which the friends of true religion and of the country's best interests were then placed by the plots of the malignant party, how can their adoption of such a test be branded as persecution, unless indeed it beheld that it is an imposition on a man's conscience to prevent him by any means from imposing on the consciences of others?